Okay, continuing about the mitzvah Bikur Cholim, we learned that the primary purpose of Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick, is to make sure they have their needs, when they're sick and so on. But now there's an interesting din like this. There's a din in halacha. The Gemara says, mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames. If a dead person wanted something before he died, it's a mitzvah to fulfill what the dead person wanted. That's what the Gemara says. But the Rishonim write, and that's the way it's paskened on halacha, that's only if somebody heard it straight from his mouth. But what happens if somebody gave over to somebody that they should tell the kids that this is what I want? So according to halacha, many times that doesn't apply, the mitzvah of listening to the dead person, because he didn't hear it, the children didn't hear it directly from the deceased. But if they hear it directly from the deceased, so unless if it's something against halacha, so then you're supposed to listen to the dead person. We already discussed earlier what happens if a dying person said, I don't want my kids to say Kaddish for me. So then the whole question, halacha, do you have to listen, don't you listen? Basically, you don't listen. Especially if he says, let's say he has 5 boys, and he says, I want 4 saying Kaddish and 1 not. So then it's already disrespectful. They'll think he's a mamzer or it's not his kid or whatever. So then the din is for sure that he's allowed to say Kaddish. The only question is, if let's say he says to all 5 of them, I don't want anybody to say Kaddish. So then the question is Kaddish a chiyuv on the deceased, on the children? Is it kibbud av v'em a whole? But that usually doesn't happen too much. Okay. What? Of what?
They have to say or not?
They should say anyway, yeah. Now, the din is, what happens if somebody has 2 mitzvahs in front of him to do? In other words, we discussed yesterday, it's all part of the mitzvah of Yahavta L'reacha Kamecha. You have a mitzvah visiting the sick or comforting the mourners. So which one do you do first, let's say? So the din is, if you have the mitzvah Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick, and Nichem Avelim, first you visit the sick. Why do you first visit the sick over comforting the mourners? Because when you visit the sick, you can pray for him, you can give him a bracha, so you can help him more. What happens if somebody could only do one of the two? They can only do Bikur Cholim or Nichem Avelim or comforting the mourners. Which one do they do? So then the halacha says you do Nichem Avelim first, comforting the mourners. In other words, if you could do both, you do Bikur Cholim first because that's more important to daven for the sick person. But if you can only do one of the two, then you do Nichem Avelim. Why do you comfort the mourner? Because the Gemara says that is chesed with the living and the dead. Bikur Cholim is only for the living. When you comfort the mourner, you're comforting the soul of the deceased, plus you're comforting the one who's still alive. So therefore, if you can only do one of the two, Nichem Avelim, comforting the mourner, has precedence over Bikur Cholim. We discussed the other day the halacha, if you can do it over the telephone or in a letter. So most poskim say you could, because the main purpose is for them to feel good, and if they feel good, then you accomplished your mission. Another din is that halacha says you visit sick non-Jews that you're acquaintance with. You visit non-Jewish sick people also. Why? They darkei Cholim. It's called peace. You have to live peacefully with them. So there's a lot, like it says, you can give him tzedakah because of darkei Cholim. But things you do just to be civil, normal neighbors, so to speak. So if you have a neighbor who's not Jewish and is sick, so then there's a mitzvah to visit him also. Obviously, if you can only do a Jew or a non-Jew and you can only do one of the two, then obviously the Jew comes first. That's a biblical mitzvah, Yahavta L'reacha Kamecha. But, they always ask, for instance, this comes up a lot. A guy has a business associate or a friend, neighbor, whatever, and they die. Can a Jew go to a non-Jewish funeral? Is a Jew allowed to go to a non-Jewish funeral? So obviously, if it's inside the church, crosses all over the place, obviously you're not allowed to walk into the church, so you can't go. But just to go to a non-Jewish cemetery, let's say, where non-Jew is going to be buried, and there's not going to be crosses or everything all over the place. It's just going to be, funeral service, speak about the person, whatever. So then, halachically, you can for sure go to such a funeral. In fact, many times I get calls from shluchim and rabbis that goyim are asking them to do their funeral. They're not Jewish. Yeah. They like this Jewish rabbi, whatever, and they want him to do the non-Jewish funeral.
They can do that?
Why not? So the guy's being buried in a non-Jewish cemetery. You say some nice words about the guy. You say chapter 23 of Psalms in English. You say a few words about the concept of life and death, Okay. You can't make it, you don't do tzaddik kadin, you don't do kaddish, you don't do kemali rachmim. But, why not?
Do you need to wash on the way out?
Yeah. If you touch the dead body. No, the din is like this. A Jew, okay, let's say this is a room, yeah? God forbid there's a Jewish dead body in the room. So even if somebody is COVID distance away from them, but nevertheless, the fact that you're under the same roof brings the tumah, it's called Tumah oil, so it's the tumah of a tent, so you become tumah anyway. So a kohen would have to run out right away. What happens if a non-Jew dies in a tent? So then the din is, it's the halacha like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it's machlekes the halacha like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that a guy is not metama ba'oil. Because it says, Adam kiyamas ba'oil, if a man dies in a tent, and the Gemara says, Atam kruyim Adam, a Jew is called Adam, not a guy. A guy is called Ha'adam, refers to Goyim. A Jew is called Adam, and therefore there's no din of tumas oil by a dead body, by a guy. But if you're going to go, let's say a kohen couldn't go to a cemetery if he's going to touch it. Now sometimes you have, and there's a very big problem in New York especially, there's cemeteries, okay, here's the cemetery and here's the road, let's say the street. And you have in the cemetery trees that have branches over the graves and over the street. It's a big tree, right? So now a Jew is not allowed to walk under that tree because it's the same tent over the graves versus over the tent. In fact, there's a very famous question about El Al flights. Is a kohen allowed to go on an El Al flight? Because most of the time they're carrying bodies. They always take bodies from America to Israel. So the shaila is, if a kohen is going to go on the plane, he's sitting on the dead bodies in the cargo beneath it. So the shaila is there tumah or not? There's a whole long discussion in Allah.
It's like oil inside and it's like...
No, because the din is like this. If in the cargo space, let's see, this is the cargo space and this is the floor of the plane. If there's a tefach, a handbreadth, between the dead body and the floor, the plane floor, then
it's okay.
Then the roof stops the tumah. So then if the kohen sitting in the seat, it's not tummy because the floor of the plane stopped the tumah if there's a tefach of space between the dead body. But what happens if the cargo is filled all the way to mamish to the floor?
Oh, meaning on top of the aron.
Yeah, on top of the aron, it's all filled to the floor. Then you don't have what's called pesach tefach. Then you don't have an empty tefach. So then the tumah keeps going up to the roof.
But it's separate compartment.
It's not, because it's on top of it. And therefore I said, if there's no space between the dead body and the ceiling of the basement versus the first floor, no, then the tumah goes.
Is there any difference between first level of a house or second? With dead body on the first level or second floor, doesn't get that, does it?
It depends if there's opening for stairways.
So what happened for
The big shaila, by the way. Okay, we have a few minutes. Big shaila, l'mashul, kohenim going into hospitals. Kohenim go into hospitals. Now, most hospitals have a morgue. Right? When somebody dies, bring the body, unless if it's Chavak Adishin or something like that, they take the body right out. Otherwise, it can go into the morgue for a day or two, right? So now the question is, in the morgue, in relationship to the hospital, so you have to know actually how the hospital is built, that there's no openings from the morgue that opening into the rooms, because then a Kohen Apidim wouldn't be allowed to go into it. The reason why, I know at least in LA, the reason why Kohenim in most places are lenient that they go into hospitals, I know a lot of Kohenim that don't, but one of the reasons why Kohenim go into the hospitals is because they say most patients are goyim, and therefore you assume if there's a dead body, it's from the Rav, from the majority, which is a goy, and by a goy, there's no din of oil. Okay? But a Kohen, let's say, cannot touch the coffin of a dead goy, because that you are tamei, touching a goy.
Coffin of the body.
Huh?
Coffin of the body.
No, the body, but again, if there's space between you know what I mean?
Usually isn't the coffin like more than one tefach between the dead body and the...
Not always, depends how big the body is and the size of the coffin. I mean, it's hard to know unless you look inside the coffin, but...
Go measure.
Go measure, right?
Then you'll be tummy.
Well, somebody else can measure it instead of the guy. No, but there's a din. Now, normally, like a Kohen is not allowed to walk into a funeral home, a Jewish funeral home, right? Because there's always dead bodies in it. I mean, unless you know for sure there's no dead body in the building. But if there's a dead body in the building, a Kohen walks in, so he's going to become tummy with ohel. Even if it's in a different room, but the door's open and whatever, the tumah moves around. If the tumah moves around, then you could become tummy. Even in a Goyish mortuary, you have to be careful, because many times there's Jewish bodies there also. Yeah. But then you can say, you go by the majority of Goyim, so then you can assume the body is not a Jewish body.
But if you're tummy mess already as a non-Kohen, it doesn't matter, no?
Huh?
You're already tummy mess as a non-Kohen anyway.
Yeah, but a Kohen still cannot...
But you, as a non-Kohen.
As a Yisrael? Yeah. No, we're all tummy mace anyway.
Yeah.
But even though a Kohen's also tummy mace, really, but still he's not allowed to become tummy to a dead body. In other words, I'll give you a simple example. A caretaker, undertaker, that touches a body, correct? And then he gives Shalom Aleichem to a Kohen in Shul. The Kohen becomes tummy. Right? But that tumah doesn't matter, but he can't go directly with in front of a dead body. Machin so meiser mei machen bei mein kim schlag out der wir gaan